Now we've reached the Create WBS process. WBS is the abbreviation of Work Breakdown Structure. You will meet it pretty frequently in the future. The WBS is important because we use it to get a clear picture of all the work we have to do in the project. As you know by now, successful project management relies on very careful and thorough planning. We begin by defining the project objectives with detailed information. The Work Breakdown Structure, WBS, allows us to create the foundation for defining the work we need to do to achieve the project objectives. The WBS also establishes the framework we will use for managing the work to its completion. Create WBS is the last process we undertake in the scope management knowledge area during the planning process group. But don't forget that we still have another two processes which take place in the monitoring and controlling process group, validate scope and control scope. In the previous process, which is define scope, we defined the project work and the major deliverables, and we described them in the project scope statement document. In this process, we will break down the work and the deliverables into smaller components in order to make them more manageable. Remember this concept for the exam. It's very important. When you create the project work and the deliverables, you might write them down as a list. On a slide here, you can see a simple list for a data warehouse project. Here we've used the phase-oriented method to break down the project. The first phase is preparation and management. Then we have the analysis, design, and implementation phases. However, remember that a list can be difficult or awkward to manage, and it doesn't allow you to clearly break down a larger project into small enough pieces. So, if a list is awkward to manage, how else can we make a WBS? As you can see here, a basic outline style is one of the WBS styles which we use. When you look at the project components now, you will find it much easier to understand the work. Here is another form, which is a hierarchical style. A WBS can be presented in many forms. Hierarchical, as you can see here, outline style, or tabular, meaning as a table. Now, you can see that we've converted the list we had before into a hierarchical form, which is like a T-view subdivision of the hardware, services, or data required to produce the end product. In this format, the WBS looks like an organizational chart. The WBS chart displays the information in a hierarchical way, making it easy to have a complete overview of the deliverables, and it also lets us see how one deliverable relates to another. It also helps everybody to see the magnitude of the work that needs to be done. The PMBOK gives us the following definition of a WBS. It's a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. Remember that the WBS represents a clear description of the project deliverables and scope, the what of the project. It's not a description of a process or a schedule that defines how or when the deliverables will be produced. It also doesn't show the order of the work or any dependencies between them. Its only goal is to show the work involved in creating the product. For the exam, remember that you always have to create a WBS for any project, even if the project is small. Sometimes you can face tricky questions about this idea. Creating a WBS is a crucial part of the planning process of every type of project, whether it's external or internal. It doesn't matter which industry or discipline the project is in, and it doesn't matter what type of deliverables it has or the life cycle being used. You'll still need to create a WBS. It's absolutely critical for managing your project. Here are some benefits of having a WBS in our projects. The total project can be described as a summation of subdivided elements. Planning can be performed. Costs and budgets can be established. Time, cost, and performance can be tracked. Objectives can be linked to company resources in a logical manner. Schedules and status reporting procedures can be established. Network construction and control planning can be initiated, and from which the responsibility assignments for each element can be established. So, the WBS provides us with a roadmap to create a well-defined scope of work, and it's an important tool for scope quantification. It's a method for breaking the work down into smaller elements, which means it's more likely that we will ensure that every major and minor activity will be accounted for. The work breakdown structure, WBS, also helps to minimize project scope changes. It helps to minimize project scope creep, which I will explain later in this chapter. It ensures that the products produced by the project meet the user requirements, and it helps us to avoid unnecessary project rework and avoid cost and time overruns. What are the inputs for creating the WBS? What do we need in order to create a WBS? After we do the project scope management planning, and the collection and documentation of requirements is completed, and the preparation of the project scope statement has been done, we begin with the Create WBS process. So, we will use all the outputs from previous processes in the scope management knowledge area. First, we need the project management plan, which is from the integration management knowledge area and contains all the plans for the project. From this, we only need the scope management plan, which provides guidance on how the WBS will be created from the project scope statement. We also need the project documents, which contains the project scope statement, which is the output from the previous process define scope. If you remember, in the define scope process, we specify the work that will be included in the project. Also, we specify the work that will be excluded. Here at Create the WBS, we focus on breaking down only the approved work that will be included in the project. Also, one of the project documents we need is the requirements documentation. This is an output from the collect requirements process. There are the business requirements, stakeholder, solution requirements, and any other approved requirements we've collected during the project. We also need to take enterprise environmental factors into account, such as industry-specific WBS standard or industry best practices. For instance, you work in a construction project or IT, telecom, or software project, you might find that there are some external standards on how you create the WBS. These standards should be taken into consideration. And we need to look at the organizational process assets. Sometimes, when you work on repetitive projects or when your company has already done many similar projects, it's not logical to create the WBS from scratch every time. So you can use the previous templates, project files, and lessons learned from previous projects. There are two tools and techniques we will use: expert judgment and decomposition. Remember, you always need to seek the opinion of experts, and the creation of the WBS is no exception. You will also need inputs from the team. Creating a work breakdown structure is a team effort. Remember this for the exam too. Before we talk about the decomposition, I would like to mention that the WBS shows the project work and the deliverables. It doesn't show the tasks or the activities which you and your team have to do to achieve the project. Let's take an example from this WBS for instance. Under the analysis phase, you can see that I divided the analysis to two parts, because they are the last components in the chart or the lowest level in the chart. We call them work packages. Let's take one work package of them as an example. Let's say BI analysis, that is business intelligence analysis. BI analysis is not an activity or task your team do. Each work package should consist of nouns, in other words, the names of things, rather than verbs or actions. I will explain the activities and tasks during the next chapter in the schedule management knowledge area. Now, let's talk about the decomposition. The decomposition technique is used in this process and in the define activities process in the schedule management only. For the exam, remember, the next step after defining the scope is decomposition into smaller components. As I said, the items in the lowest level of the WBS are called work packages. A work package describes the work to be accomplished by a specific performing organization or a group of cost centers. We use it to help us in monitoring and reporting the progress of the work. The work package is the critical level for managing a work breakdown structure as shown here. Sometimes, the actual management of the work packages is supervised and performed by the line managers, who report the status to the project manager at high levels of the WBS. The concept of decomposition is breaking down, dividing, and subdividing the project scope and the project deliverables into smaller and more manageable parts. You can then estimate and manage both the cost and the duration. With the WBS, you can easily break down the work into work packages, and the WBS shows how the work packages are derived. There's an added benefit to creating the WBS too. The process of creating a WBS allows you and your team to work through the project in your minds, and so it improves the project plan. The execution of the project should be easier and less risky as a result. All the elements of the WBS don't need to be defined to the same level. To arrive at a work package, the work for some deliverables needs to be decomposed only to the next level, while some others will need additional levels of decomposition. Remember that work packages are unique and shouldn't be duplicated across the work breakdown structure. As I'm sure you've worked out already, the top level of the WBS represents the final deliverable, or project. It's important to know that each work package is part of a control account. A control account is a management control point where scope, budget, and schedule are integrated. Another name for control account is control point, sometimes referred to as a phase review, phase gate, control gate. I hope you remember that I explained the control account during the project phase. A control account is the level above the work packages, and it has two or more work packages, though each work package is associated with a single control account. Sometimes, while you create the WBS, you don't have enough information about the activity schedule, but you know the work involved. So, if the duration, cost, or resource need is not yet clear, it's named a planning package. A planning package is a component of the work breakdown structure. It's below the control account and above the work package, and it has non-work content, but it doesn't have detailed schedule activities. So the planning packages contain work and budget that have been identified as belonging to a control account, but which we haven't assigned to a work package yet. We will do that in the future, because the detailed planning for this might not yet be complete. So remember that not all control accounts will have planning packages, and that planning packages are a future effort that's not planned in detail at the control account level. I would like to mention that the rolling wave planning process, progressive elaboration, repeatedly converts planning packages into control accounts or work packages. You also need to know that each component in the WBS has a numbering system. It's called a code of accounts, and it represents the level of each component. So here, you can see that the first component, Data Warehouse Project, takes a code 1, and the lower level takes the upper level code, plus its own code to form a series. So we have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. And the work package components take the code 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and so on. By the way, the numbering system, or the code of accounts, doesn't mean it only uses numbers. It might use a different alphanumeric system. For example, a combination of letters and numbers. Here's the level structure of a traditional WBS. The upper levels of the WBS are normally specified by the customer if they are part of an RFP, request for a proposal, or contract as the summary levels for reporting purposes. The lower levels are usually created by the contractor. Each level has an essential purpose. Level 1 is generally used for the authorization and release of all work. Budgets are prepared at level 2, and schedules are prepared at level 3. The lowest level represents the work that should be done. We will talk about the WBS structure using an agile approach later. Now, let's talk about the methods we usually use to create the WBS. How do we create a WBS? Well, a WBS structure may be created in many different ways. Here are some of the common methods: top-down approach, bottom-up approach, guidelines or standards, and templates, or a combination of all or some of them. First, the top-down approach. The top-down approach is when you take the biggest elements in the project and break them down. This is a preferred method for creating the WBS and the easy way to create it. This approach will identify the solution first and then decompose the solution into smaller steps required to implement it. This is very like what we did before. For instance, you are a project manager for a software ERP project. So you start with the ERP itself as the top level. Then you will divide the software into the second level. For example, accounting, warehouse, HR, etc. Then you will start to divide each component into sub-levels: analysis, database structure, logical layers, business layer, interfaces, etc. The second method is the bottom-up approach, which we can use to group subcomponents. This method is useful if you already have the work packages and you are grouping them until you reach the top level. For instance, you are contacted by a customer. He has many spreadsheets which he needs to convert into a desktop or web application. Now you have the work packages, the lowest level of the deliverables. For example, the spreadsheets. You already have the names and the functions for each spreadsheet. Now you must combine the spreadsheets into groups based on their functionality. Then you will group these groups into a higher level group, this time based on the department they are dealing with, for instance, and so on, until you get the whole project, which automates the business processes the spreadsheets are used for. The third method involves the use of organization-specific guidelines. Here, you are following organizational and industry guidelines or standards. An organizational WBS standard is a set of principles for constructing a WBS and might include a format, numbering schema, naming convention, or required elements. In this method, the formats of the WBS are predefined. The challenge with following the organizational guidance is making a project fit the standard. But remember that one size doesn't fit all, and not all projects fit into a highly structured set of WBS standards. And finally, using templates. This involves following organizational and industry templates. This is good because it provides a starting point for the WBS creation, and because it might help determine the appropriate level of detail required. Which method you choose should be based on the specific project objectives, requirements, assumptions, and constraints. Let's move on to look at the different types of decomposition. By the way, these types are not mentioned in the PMBOK, but they are included in the Practice Standard for Work Breakdown Structures 3rd edition. Some of them are implied in the PMBOK. A work breakdown structure, WBS, can be action-oriented, backlog-oriented, contract-oriented, deliverable-oriented, phase-oriented, product-oriented, program-oriented, or even a combination of these. Let's take some examples. A phase-oriented WBS focuses on the project phase-based components. For instance, the planning phase, the analysis phase, and the design phase. Also, the WBS decomposition can be product-oriented, which means it focuses on any component that's a part of the final product. For instance, BI system, missile system, or bicycle frame set, car frame, etc. It can also be based on the project development life cycle. For instance, if you use an agile approach, the WBS can be backlog-oriented. That means breaking down the project into epics, then iterations or sprints. The next level is backlogs, then features, then user stories. I will show you an example later. Based on the project size, type, and complexity, you can select the type of WBS decomposition you will use, or you can tailor and combine between these types. There are various forms we can use to represent the WBS structure. Project managers normally manage at the top levels of the WBS and prefer to provide status reports to management at these levels also. This is an example of a phase-oriented WBS for the project lifecycle as the second level of decomposition. For instance, project management phase, product requirements, detailed design, construction, and integration and test phases. And we insert the product and the project deliverables at the third level. So, under project management, we have planning, meetings, and administration. And under product requirements phase, we have software, user documentation, and training program materials, and so on. An alternative to that is using the major deliverables for the second level of decomposition. This is an aircraft system project. The major deliverables are project management, training, data, etc. Under project management, we have system engineering management and supporting project management activities. Under training, we have equipment training, facilities training, and services training, and so on. This is a contract-oriented form of WBS. Imagine you are a project manager for any project, and you are subcontracting out of work for the implementation. You will include the implementation in your WBS. The seller will then develop their own WBS for implementation. However, you will include the major deliverables for implementation in your WBS. The seller's major deliverables must match those in your WBS. Various WBS scenarios exist for agile projects. As you know, nowadays most software projects use an agile or Scrum approach. There are several different approaches to decompose agile projects. For instance, as you can see here, the first level is the project or product name. On the second level, we use epics, then features, then iterations or sprints, then the last level represents the user stories. Another agile WBS approach we can use starts with a project or product name, then releases, then the next level is features, then iterations or sprints, and the last level is always user stories. Let me give you a simple example. I hope it will help you understand the difference between these terms. Imagine that you watch an action movie. The action movie is a project. There are many actions in this movie. There are shooting actions, running actions, fighting actions, etc. These actions are epics. Now you want to tell stories to your friend about one of these epics. So you use user stories to describe one scene. In the movie, you will see many features for one epic. These features can have many iterations, then many user stories. In Agile, the last level is always user stories. In the traditional WBS, the lowest level is called a work package, while in the Agile WBS, the lowest level is user stories. Work packages are roughly equal to user stories. Remember these points for the PMP exam. If you remember, we described the user stories during the collect requirements process. A user story takes the format of, as a type of user, I want to be able to do something so that I can get a specific result. These user stories are usually groups of tasks which are simple, short, and easy to implement and complete within a sprint. Epics are written in the initial stages of the project when most user stories are high-level functionalities or product descriptions and requirements are broadly defined. Let's have a look at rolling wave planning. Rolling wave planning is an iterative planning technique in which we plan in detail the work we want to accomplish in the short term, while we plan future work at a higher level. It's a form of a progressive elaboration. So the work packages, which we will implement sooner, have more detail than those further in the future. However, it's important to know that exaggeration is also wrong. Some project managers measure their professionality by the number of WBS components they create, so they decompose the work to too many levels. But this excessive decomposition can lead to non-productive management effort, inefficient use of resources, decreased efficiency in performing the work, and difficulty aggregating data over different levels of the WBS. At the end, you need to verify that you are decomposing the deliverables to an appropriate level. One of the WBS decomposition principles is called the 100% rule. Remember that this rule is a core characteristic of the WBS. The total of all the work at the lowest levels of a WBS equals 100% of the work of the higher levels. This principle is known as the 100% rule. It states that the WBS includes 100% of the work defined by the project scope and captures all deliverables, internal and external, in terms of work to be completed, including project management. For the future, remember that this rule is one of the most important principles guiding the development, decomposition, and evaluation of the WBS. The rule applies at all levels within the hierarchy. The sum of the work at the child level must equal 100% of the work represented by the parent, and the WBS shouldn't include any work that's outside of the actual scope of the project. So, in other words, it cannot include more than 100% of the work. Now, let's look at the outputs. This is very important for the PMP exam. These are the outputs we get from the Create WBS process. The scope baseline is the main output. What is it? The project scope statement, which is the output of the defined scope process, along with the WBS and WBS Dictionary. All three of these together are known as the scope baseline. I will explain the WBS Dictionary in the next slide. As you know, the WBS contains work packages and the planning packages, which I have already explained. All of these comprise the scope baseline, which is a component of the project management plan, which is the output of the developed project management plan process in the integration knowledge area. Maybe it's a little early to mention this, but it's nice to be familiar with it for the next knowledge areas. Remember that we have three major baselines in the PMBOK, and all of them are part of the project management plan: scope baseline, schedule baseline, and cost baseline. We'll use these baselines as an input to most of the processes, and we will update them throughout the project as required using a formal change request, because the baselines are the approved version of their contents. For the PMP exam, remember that a baseline can be changed only through formal change control procedures. So, once the scope is approved, we can't add or remove any part of it, even if the customer asks us to do so, unless we have an approved change request from the sponsor or the change control board. Once you have it, you have to update all the scope baseline components. Before we start implementing any changes in the scope baseline, first we have to get a formal change request. Then we need to analyze the impact on the project, because the change might impact the cost or the project duration, for instance. After we've analyzed the impact, we present the aspects of the project which will be impacted by the change to the senior management, maybe the sponsor, the program manager, or portfolio manager. Then we will get approval for the change request. If the change request is approved, then we will update the scope baseline. That means we will update the project scope statement, WBS and WBS Dictionary, and you update any aspect of the project which is impacted by the change. Once the WBS is established and the project is kicked off, it becomes a very costly procedure to either add or delete activities. If the project is not large or complex, an informal written memo or note can replace the change request. The main point is that no significant changes in the project are made without written notice following top management's approval. The scope baseline is used as a basis for comparison. In the next processes, we will learn how to validate and control the scope. These two processes take place in the monitoring and controlling process group. When we do that, we use the scope baseline in order to compare the actual work with the approved version of the scope. For instance, imagine you are a project manager for a website project, and the customer needs you to add a new page. The scope baseline, which contains the project scope statement, WBS and WBS Dictionary, tells you whether you can add it or not, and you can compare the page with the scope to see whether it's within the scope or not. If it's not, then you will need to issue a formal change request following which you have to analyze the impact and get the changes approved by the sponsor or any authorized stakeholder. Now, let's talk about the WBS Dictionary. This is a simple template for the WBS Dictionary as a table. The WBS Dictionary is a detailed description of each component in the WBS and includes critical project information. We use it to ensure that each component of the WBS is accurately explained and can be communicated to anyone referencing the WBS. You can think of the WBS as a foreign language. The WBS Dictionary acts like a normal dictionary to translate the language into something everyone can understand. The WBS Dictionary includes the Code of Account Identifier. This is the WBS code or the code of account as we explained before. It also includes the description of work in each WBS component required to produce each deliverable, and the assumptions and constraints. You might have assumptions and constraints on the project level, but also maybe there are assumptions and constraints on the control account or work package levels. It also includes details of the responsible organization. You can specify the organization and the department too based on the project, since big projects have many organizations involved. Here you have to specify which organization is responsible for each component. It also has the schedule milestones. You want to put milestone start and end dates in order to complete each component. The associated schedule activities are also included. The various elements of the WBS are used as starting points for defining the activities included in the project schedule. Dependencies between items can be recorded in the WBS Dictionary, and the activities as described in the WBS Dictionary are then included as detail in the schedule. Don't forget, the work packages don't represent activities or the tasks which should be done by the project team. So here you can specify the activities which are related to the work package. However, we will talk about this in detail during the schedule management knowledge area. The next attribute of the WBS Dictionary is the resources required. You might also include an indication of the type and number of resources required and contract control information such as charge number or other similar data. By the way, resources means anything you need to achieve the project, such as labor resources or materials, equipment, tools, services, etc. We will talk about it in detail during the resource management knowledge area. The WBS Dictionary also contains the cost estimates, like material or equipment costs or labor costs, and the quality requirements, which document any quality requirements or metrics for the work package, like regular reviews for quality requirements, quality management activities, and quality audits. We also have to specify the acceptance criteria. This describes the acceptance criteria for the deliverable. Usually you find this information in the scope statement. The work packages describe the deliverables, and you as a project manager with a team deliver these work packages to the customer. So you need to know how the customer will accept these work packages and what the criteria should be achieved for each work package. Here you also specify the technical references. These describe any technical requirements or documentation needed to complete the work package. And finally, the agreement information. This is the reference for the contract or agreement between the buyer and seller that impacts the work package. Our second output is project documents updates. It's necessary to update the project documents once you have carried out the Create WBS process. Two of the key documents which you will update are the assumption log, which is updated with any additional assumptions or constraints that you identified during creation of the WBS, and the requirements documentation, which is an output from the collect requirements process. You update it to include any approved changes that resulted from the Create WBS process. And that's the end of the Create WBS process.